I moved to the city to escape a ghost, only to find one waiting for me. But this ghost wasn't frightening. He was just desperately, impossibly lonely. And the only way he could reach me was to leave the outline of a smile on my bedroom window every morning. The apartment was supposed to be my sanctuary. 400 square feet of anonymous white walls and scuffed linoleum, tucked into a building where nobody asked questions and the rent didn't require references I couldn't provide. After 3 months of sleeping on Grace's couch, watching her pity evolve into polite resentment, I needed this place like oxygen. I moved in on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, I'd arranged my few possessions with obsessive care, books alphabetized, clothes folded with military precision, my single mug positioned just so on the counter. The emptiness still screamed at me. The silence had teeth. That first night, I lay awake on the bare mattress, listening to pipes groan and strangers argue through paper-thin walls. The window beside my bed fogged with my breath in the November cold, moisture gathering in silver rivulets that caught the streetlight outside. I watched condensation bloom and fade until exhaustion finally pulled me under. I woke to find someone had been watching me sleep. The fog on the window had been wiped away, not completely, but deliberately. A single shape remained in the center of the glass where my head had rested. A smile. Not smudged or accidental. Not the random swipe of a palm or the drag of fingers. A perfectly rendered curve, small and intimate, drawn with impossible precision in the moisture. I stared at it for 3 whole minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I told myself I'd done it in my sleep. Some unconscious gesture, my hand reaching out in a dream. I wiped it away with my sleeve and tried to forget it. The next morning, it was back. The third morning, I woke before dawn, with my hand already reaching for the window. The smile was there, smaller than before, positioned precisely at eye level where I'd been sleeping. In the gray pre-dawn light, it looked almost tender, a gentle curve that a careful finger could have drawn, if fingers left marks that precise in condensation. The moisture around it had already begun to slide downward in thin trails, but the smile itself remained pristine, untouched by gravity. I sat up slowly, my breath catching. The apartment was freezing. I'd turned the heat down to save money, and now frost feathered the edges of the window pane in delicate fractals. But inside that ring of frost, in the center where my face had been, the smile waited. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Heat from my sleeping body, the angle of my breath against the glass. Some quirk of air pressure or humidity that I didn't understand, but that surely had a scientific explanation. I was a woman who alphabetized her books. I didn't believe in things that couldn't be explained. I wiped it away with my palm, more complicated than necessary. The glass squeaked under the pressure. When I pulled my hand back, my skin was damp and cold, and the window was clear. "Stop it," I said aloud, to myself, to the empty room, to whatever part of my subconscious was playing tricks in my sleep. My voice sounded thin and foreign. I went through my morning routine with aggressive normalcy, coffee in my single mug. I ate the toast standing at the counter. I checked my phone, 2 job rejections in my inbox, neither bothering with encouragement. I deleted them without responding and tried not to calculate how many weeks of rent I had left. When I returned to the bedroom to dress, I made myself look at the window. It was clear, just glass and frost, and the gray morning pressing against it. No smile, no impossible marking. Relief flooded through me so intensely that my knees weakened. I was tired, stressed, grieving things I didn't want to name. Of course, my mind was inventing patterns in randomness, finding meaning in condensation. It was almost funny, really. Almost. I dressed quickly and left for another day of job applications at the library, where the Wi-Fi was free And I didn't have to sit alone in that apartment, listening to the silence arrange itself into shapes I didn't want to see. That night, I left the window open a crack before bed, letting the November cold pour in until my teeth chattered. No condensation meant no smile. Simple as that. I fell asleep telling myself I'd solved it. The smile returned the next morning anyway. I woke to find it there despite the open window, despite the cold air that had turned my bedroom into an icebox, despite every rational precaution I'd taken. It curved across the glass in that same deliberate arc, utterly unbothered by the laws of thermodynamics. The window was cold to the touch, too cold for condensation. I knew this. I pressed my palm flat against it anyway, feeling the shock of frost bite into my skin, and when I pulled away, there was nothing. No fog, no moisture, just the smile, watching. My hand was shaking. I made it stop. That night, I dried the window obsessively before bed, running a towel over every inch of glass until it squeaked. I checked it 3 times, running my fingers across the surface, holding it up to the lamplight to catch any missed moisture. Nothing. The glass was bone dry. I left the towel on the nightstand like a talisman and turned off the light. In the morning, the smile was there. Sharper this time. More defined. As if it had grown tired of my denial and decided to make itself unmistakable. I stared at it for a long time, my coffee going cold in my hand, my mind performing increasingly desperate gymnastics. Perhaps I was drawing it myself in my sleep, some parasomnia I'd never experienced before. Maybe it was damage to the glass that only appeared under certain light conditions. Perhaps my grief had finally broken something fundamental in my perception of reality. None of these explanations felt true. They felt like stories I was telling myself to avoid the only conclusion that made sense. Something was happening that shouldn't be possible. I thought about calling someone. But who? My mother, who already worried I was falling apart. A friend from my old life, to prove I still had one? And what would I say? There's a smile on my window that won't go away. They'd think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. I wiped it away again, viciously this time, scrubbing until my arm ached. The glass was clear. I got dressed. I left. But all day at the library, between job applications I no longer believed would matter, I kept seeing it. That curve. That deliberate, impossible curve. And beneath my fear, something else was growing. Something I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't quite suppress. I called Grace on the 4th morning, before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice bright and caffeinated in a way that made my chest ache. Grace still had a job. Grace still had a routine that didn't involve watching condensation that shouldn't exist arrange itself into impossible shapes. Ev, God, it's been forever. How are you? How's the new place? Fine, I said, then immediately regretted calling. What was I going to say? But Grace had already heard the hesitation, the way my voice caught on that single syllable. That doesn't sound fine. What's wrong? I traced the edge of my laptop with one finger, stalling. Outside my window, morning traffic hummed past in an indifferent stream. Do you believe in ghosts? The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call had dropped. Then Grace laughed, tentative and confused. Is this a philosophy question, or? Never mind. Forget it. No, wait. Ev, talk to me. Are you okay? Is something happening? I wanted to tell her. About the smile, about the tests I'd run like some amateur scientist trying to disprove her own sanity. But hearing her voice, so normal, so tethered to a world where windows behaved predictably, made the whole thing sound absurd even in my own head. I'm fine, I said again. Just weird insomnia. You know how it is. If you're having trouble sleeping, maybe you should talk to someone. A professional, I mean. There's no shame in. I have to go. I'll call you later. I hung up before she could argue, before the concern in her voice could crystallize into something more pointed. Grace meant well, but she lived in a world where problems had solutions, where sadness meant therapy, and strange experiences meant stress. She couldn't help me with this. I opened my laptop instead. The building was old, but not historic in any meaningful way. Just another early 20th century walk-up that had survived through indifference rather than preservation. The landlord's website was aggressively generic. Stock photos of smiling people who definitely didn't live here, amenities that didn't exist, a rental application that asked for references I no longer had. I tried searching the address with different terms. History, deaths, tragedy, accident. Most results were just real estate listings, the building's value rising and falling with the neighborhood's fortunes over decades. But buried in the fourth page of results, I found a newspaper archive from 1987. Woman, 34, found dead in apartment. The article was brief, almost dismissive. Sophie Marsh, unmarried, unemployed, discovered after neighbors complained about the smell. No signs of foul play. Probable suicide, though the article danced around the word with careful euphemisms. Troubled, isolated, no known family. I read it 3 times, my coffee going cold again, untouched. The apartment number wasn't listed, but something in my stomach turned anyway, heavy and certain. I kept searching, but Sophie Marsh left almost no trace. No obituary. No social media remnants from the early days of the internet. Just that single article, clinical and brief, and then nothing. A life that had folded into itself so completely that even its ending barely registered. Outside, the November sky was pressing gray against my window. I didn't turn to look at it. I already knew what I'd find. There, waiting with that patient, impossible curve. The oldest resident in the building was a man named Thomas Reeve, and I found him by accident. I'd been checking my mailbox in the lobby, empty except for a flyer for pizza delivery, when I heard the shuffle of careful footsteps on the stairs. He moved slowly, one hand on the railing, the other clutching a canvas grocery bag that looked older than me. He must have been in his 70s, maybe 80s, with that particular thinness that comes from decades rather than illness. "Excuse me," I said, before I could think better of it. "Do you live here? In this building?" He paused on the landing, assessing me with eyes that were still sharp despite the cloudiness at their edges. 42 years, he said. His voice had the gravel of a long-time smoker. "You're new." "3rd floor." "Yes." "3B." I hesitated, feeling foolish. I was wondering, do you know anything about the building's history? About the people who lived here before? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite suspicion, but a careful neutrality that told me he knew exactly why I was asking. "Which one?" he said finally. My heart kicked against my ribs. "I'm sorry. Which ghost are you asking about?" He said it matter-of-factly, the way someone. "I would like to know which bus route I need to take." "Old building. Lots of stories." 3B, I whispered. "My apartment." Thomas looked at me for a long moment, then nodded toward the stairs. "Come up. I'll make tea." His apartment was a time capsule, floral wallpaper, furniture from the 70s, photographs covering every available surface. He moved through it with the efficiency of long habit, filling a kettle, setting out mismatched mugs. I sat at his kitchen table and waited, my hands folded to keep them still. "Daniel Vance," Thomas said finally, settling into the chair across from me. "That was his name. Lived in your unit from 81 to 85. Nice kid. Quiet. Too quiet, maybe." The kettle began to whistle, but Thomas didn't move. He was looking past me, into some middle distance where the past was more vivid than the present. He was 26 when he died. Lost his job that winter. The factory closed, took half the neighborhood down with it. His girl left him. Then his mother died, and he didn't have anyone else. No siblings. Father had been gone for years. Thomas's voice was flat, reciting facts, but his hands trembled slightly around his mug. I used to hear him through the walls sometimes, crying, or maybe laughing. Hard to tell the difference when someone's that far gone. I thought of Sophie Marsh, the woman I'd found in the archives. Wrong name, wrong year, wrong person entirely. How did he die? Pills. They found him by the window. Thomas finally looked at me, and his eyes were sad in a way that seemed practiced, worn smooth by repetition. He left a note. Just one line. I wanted someone to see me smile. That's what his landlord told me, anyway. Police kept the note, but word gets around in a building like this. The kitchen was tranquil. Outside, I could hear traffic, someone's television through the wall, the ordinary sounds of life continuing. Inside, I felt something settle into place, not understanding, but recognition. He drew it, I said softly, on the window, before he died. Thomas didn't ask how I knew. He just nodded slowly, the gesture of someone confirming what he'd already suspected. You've seen it then. Every morning. He was lonely, Thomas said, and now his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. Not just alone. Lonely in that way that eats you from the inside. Toward the end, I'd see him standing at that window for hours, watching people pass by on the street. Never going down to join them. Just watching. He finally stood, tended to the screaming kettle, and poured water over tea bags that smelled of bergamot and dust. When he set the mug in front of me, his hand briefly touched my shoulder. Some people leave more than belongings behind, he said. Daniel was one of them. I wrapped my hands around the mug, feeling its warmth, and thought about a young man standing at my window, pressing his finger to the glass, making the only mark that would outlast him. A smile. A lie. A wish. The lights started flickering on the fifth night. Not dramatically, not the horror movie strobe that would have let me dismiss it as faulty wiring and call the landlord. Just a slight dimming, a hesitation, as if the electricity itself was uncertain. It happened while I was heating soup on the stove, and in that brief dip in brightness, the kitchen felt different. Smaller, more crowded, though I was alone. I turned off the burner and stood very still, listening. Nothing. Just the building's usual symphony of other people's lives through the walls. But the air had changed somehow, grown thicker, and beneath the smell of canned tomato soup, there was something else. Something clean and sharp and masculine. Cologne, maybe, or aftershave. The kind of young man in the 80s might have worn, trying to feel put together when everything inside was falling apart. Daniel, I said to the empty kitchen. My voice came out steadier than I expected. The lights flickered again, just once, and then held. The scent faded. But I knew, the way you know someone's watching you even when you can't see them, that I wasn't alone anymore. Maybe I never had been. I stopped wiping away the smile after that. It didn't feel kind, somehow. Erasing the only mark he'd left, the only proof that he'd existed in this space, that he'd felt something worth recording even at the end. So I let it stay. And in waiting, it began to change. The cold spot appeared 2 days later, a pocket of air by the window that had nothing to do with drafts or failing insulation. It was precisely body-sized, as if someone was standing there, and when I moved through it, the temperature dropped so sharply I could see my breath. I started leaving that space empty when I moved through the room, stepping around it the way you'd step around a person. My laptop died 3 times in one evening, the battery draining from complete to empty in minutes even while plugged in. My phone did the same. Thomas had mentioned that sometimes spirits drew energy from electronics, from anything that could give them substance, voice, presence. I started charging everything in the kitchen, leaving the bedroom to Daniel. At night, I could hear it sometimes, a soft sound like breathing that wasn't quite breathing. More like the memory of breath, the ghost of lungs that had stopped working 40 years ago. It should have terrified me. Instead, it felt almost companionable, two isolated people sharing space in the dark, neither quite belonging to the world anymore. I'd stopped applying for jobs I knew I wouldn't get, stopped answering Grace's increasingly worried texts, stopped pretending I was doing anything but surviving, barely, in this apartment that had become both prison and sanctuary. And Daniel understood. I could feel it in the way the cold spot seemed to shift closer when I sat by the window, in the way the lights steadied when I spoke aloud about nothing, just filling the silence with proof that someone still had a voice. We were the same, he and I, watching life from behind glass, too tired or too broken to reach through it. On the 8th morning, I woke and looked at the window before my eyes were fully open. The smile was there, but below it, something new had appeared, a single line, drawn downward from the curve's edge. Thin, deliberate, unmistakable. A tear. I got out of bed slowly and stood in the cold spot, feeling the temperature drop around me like an embrace. The smile and its tear looked back at me from the glass, and I understood what Daniel was trying to say. What maybe he'd been trying to say all along. I see you. I see you seeing me. We're the same. I pressed my palm to the window, right below the tear line, and left it there until the glass fogged around my hand. When I pulled away, my handprint remained. Warm breath made visible, a response in the only language we had left. I know. I whispered to the empty room that wasn't empty. I know how it feels. The lights flickered once, gently, like agreement. The door wouldn't open on the 10th morning. I'd been trying to leave for the library, not because I had any real purpose there anymore, but because the apartment had started to feel too small, the air too thick. I needed to move, to be among other people, to remember what it felt like to exist in a world that continued outside these walls. The deadbolt turned. The handle turned. But the door stayed shut, as if something on the other side was holding it closed with invisible hands. Come on, I muttered, pulling harder. Nothing. I tried the chain lock, though I knew I hadn't engaged it, and tried the deadbolt again. Put my shoulder against the wood and pushed with all my weight. The door didn't budge. Behind me, the apartment was tranquil. That particular quality of silence that means someone is listening, waiting to see what you'll do next. The cold spot had migrated from the window to the center of the room, and I could feel it there, a presence that had grown denser, more insistent over the past few days. Daniel. I kept my voice steady, reasonable, though my heart was hammering. I need to go out. Just for a few hours. I'll come back. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. The pattern felt like disagreement. I tried my phone, but the screen stayed black even after charging it overnight in the kitchen. I held down the power button, pushed the side buttons, and shook it as that would help. Nothing. Just dead weight in my hand, as useless as everything else I owned. This isn't funny, I said louder now. You can't keep me here. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't quite true. Whatever Daniel had become, whatever grief and loneliness had calcified into after 40 years of haunting this room, it was strong enough to drain batteries, to hold doors shut, to remake the physical world in small but definite ways. Strong enough to keep one more isolated person right where he wanted her. I went to the window and tried to open it, painted shut, or something worse. My fingers couldn't find purchase under the frame. I pressed my face close to the glass, looking down at the street 3 stories below. People passed by in their usual morning rush. Coffee cups, briefcases, headphones, all the armor of ordinary life. So close, impossibly far. The smile was still there on the glass, and the tear below it, but now they looked different. Not sad. Satisfied. the expression of someone who'd finally gotten what they wanted. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, quieter now. My breath fogged the glass, obscuring the marks. "I understand. I know what it's like to be lonely. But trapping me here." The temperature in the room dropped so sharply that I gasped. The cold spot moved closer, directly behind me now, and I could feel something in it. Not just absence of warmth, but presence. Wait. Intention. My laptop on the desk suddenly opened its own screen, the display glowing to life despite being powered down. Words began appearing in a new document, typed by invisible fingers. "Outside hurts. People hurt. Safe here. Together." I watched the words form, letter by letter, and felt something in my chest constrict. He thought he was protecting me, keeping me from the world that had rejected us both, that had let us fall through its cracks until we landed here, in this room where suffering had soaked so deep into the walls it had learned to think. "Daniel," I said carefully, "this isn't safety. This is just more of what killed you." The laptop screen went dark. The cold spot retreated to the window, and I heard that sound again, the ghost of breathing, but faster now, agitated. The lights began flickering in rapid sequence, and books started falling from my shelf one by one, hitting the floor with dull thuds that sounded like a heartbeat. He was angry, or scared, or both. I backed away from the window, my mind racing through options I didn't have. No phone, no door, no window. Just me and a dead man who'd mistaken isolation for safety, who thought love meant keeping someone close even if you had to lock them in to do it, just like I'd been doing to myself for months. The thought hit me so hard I had to sit down on the bed. How many times had I chosen not to answer Grace's calls? How many invitations had I declined? How many connections had I let wither because it was easier to be alone than to risk being rejected again? I'd been building my own prison long before Daniel had locked the door. "Okay," I said aloud. To Daniel, to myself, to the suffocating air between us. "Okay, I understand. But this, us staying locked in, here together, it won't fix anything." It didn't fix it for you. The flickering stopped. The books stopped falling. In the sudden stillness, I could hear my own heartbeat. Too fast, too loud. On the laptop screen, new words appeared. "Don't leave me alone." And there it was. The core of it. Not possessiveness, but terror. The same terror that had been eating at me since I'd moved into this apartment, this city, this life I didn't recognize. The fear that if people couldn't see you, you might stop existing altogether. "I won't," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "But you have to let me leave. You have to let me come back by choice." The cold spot stayed by the window. The door remained shut, and I sat on the bed in that locked room, trapped with a ghost who understood me better than anyone alive, and wondered which of us was really haunting the other. The library smelled of old leather and dust motes suspended in afternoon light. Evelyn ran her fingers along the spines of books she'd alphabetized 100 times. Books she could locate blindfolded. Books that held no mysteries for her anymore except one. The volume sat where it always had, third shelf from the bottom, wedged between a collection of romantic poetry and a water-damaged copy of Wuthering Heights. She'd noticed it before, noticed how Daniel's eyes would linger on its burgundy spine during their sessions, how his hand would sometimes drift toward it before he caught himself and pulled away. The complete works of Soren Kierkegaard. Today, with Daniel upstairs sleeping off another panic attack, she pulled it free. The book fell open naturally to a hollowed-out center. Her breath caught. Inside the carved-out pages lay a leather journal, its cover soft with handling, its edges worn to velvet. She knew she shouldn't. She knew this was a violation of the professional distance she'd maintained so carefully. She opened it anyway. The first entry was dated 3 years ago, written in Daniel's precise, slanting hand. They tell me I'm getting better. Dr. Reeves is pleased with my progress. Mother smiles at dinner now. But they don't understand. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm so scared of how much I want to. Evelyn's hands trembled. She turned the page. I've perfected the art of isolation. It's not that people leave me. I've learned how to make them go. A cold word here, a withdrawn evening there. I've become a sculptor of absence, and loneliness is my masterpiece. If I can make myself untouchable, if I can prove that connection is impossible, then perhaps this gnawing ache will finally make sense. The entries continued, each one a careful dissection of self-sabotage. He detailed the way he'd pushed away his university friends, manufacturing arguments over nothing. How he'd rejected his sister's invitations until she stopped extending them. The deliberate cultivation of his reputation was difficult, unapproachable, impossible. I'm creating external circumstances that match my internal reality. If everyone leaves, then I'm not defective. I'm just alone. There's a strange comfort in that, in making the unbearable feel inevitable. Evelyn turned pages with increasing urgency, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found sketches in the margins, nooses rendered in careful detail, pill bottles counted and recounted, a bathtub drawn with geometric precision. Not plans. Love letters to ideas he couldn't quite let go of. Then, dated 2 months ago, shortly after she'd arrived. A new nurse today. Miss Carter. She has kind eyes, the sort that see too much. I'll need to be careful. I find myself wanting to talk to her, really talk, and that's dangerous. The last time I let someone in, I spent 6 months afterwards wishing I'd succeeded in March. Better to keep her at arm's length. Better to stay in this carefully constructed prison I've built. Better to be alone than to be seen and still feel alone. That second kind of loneliness would destroy what's left of me. The page blurred. Evelyn realized she was crying. She flipped forward, skimming entries about their sessions together. He'd noticed everything. The way she tilted her head when listening, how she always left the curtains slightly open, the particular care she took with his medication timing. He'd cataloged her kindnesses and his resistance to them in equal measure. She asked me today why I never learned to play the piano in the music room. I almost told her, because learning requires hope, because practicing implies a future, because every beautiful thing I touch reminds me that I'm temporary, and maybe that's how I prefer it. I'm starting to fear she'll save me. Worse, I'm beginning to worry I'll let her. The most recent entry was from yesterday. I had another attack today. She held my hand through it, steady as a lighthouse. When it passed, she looked at me with something that might have been understanding, and I felt the walls I've spent years building begin to crack. I'm terrified. I'm frightened because for the first time in 3 years, I felt something other than the weight. I felt something like possibility, and I don't know if I can bear it. What if I get better and discover that the pain doesn't leave? What if I climb out of this hole I've dug and find that the sun still doesn't warm me? At least now I have an explanation. At least now I can say, I hurt because I'm alone. What excuse will I have when someone stays? Evelyn closed the journal carefully, her hands shaking. She understood now. Understood with a clarity that made her chest ache. His circumstances didn't trap Daniel. He'd built his own cage, bar by careful bar, because the cage was familiar. Because loneliness he'd chosen felt safer than loneliness that might pick him. He was afraid not of being abandoned, but of being seen completely and still feeling empty. Afraid that connection wouldn't cure him. Worried that he was fundamentally, irreparably broken, and that love would only prove it. She replaced the journal in its hiding place and slid the book back onto the shelf. Her mind was already racing ahead, recalculating her approach, understanding now what she was really fighting against. Not depression, not anxiety, but the terrible, seductive logic of a mind that had learned to find safety in its own suffering. And for the first time since arriving at Thornfield House, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Not sympathy, not even compassion, but a cold, crystalline understanding. She knew his weakness now, knew the exact shape of his fear. She knew how to break him open. And God help her, she was going to do it. Upstairs, she heard him stirring. She smoothed her apron, composed her face, and went to meet him with the same gentle smile she always wore. But behind her eyes, something had changed. She'd found his secret. She'd seen the blueprints to his prison. Now she just had to decide whether she was picking the lock to set him free, or stepping inside to lock the door behind her. She chose twilight. That liminal hour when the house held its breath between day and night, when Daniel was most present, most vulnerable. Evelyn climbed the stairs to his room with the journal clutched against her chest like a shield. The door swung open before she could touch it. "You shouldn't have read that." His voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The walls, the floorboards, the very air that pressed against her skin. The room was freezing, her breath misting in the sudden cold. "I know." She stepped inside anyway. "I know what you did, Daniel. I know the truth." The temperature plummeted. Frost began to creep across the windows in jagged, angry patterns. She could see him now, a shadow darker than the gathering dusk, standing by the four-poster bed where he'd spent so many sleepless nights. "You don't know anything." The words were laced with something that might have been panic. "You think you understand, but you chose this." The words exploded from her, months of careful composure shattering. "You chose to be alone. You pushed everyone away, systematically, deliberately, and then her voice cracked. "Then you made it permanent." The shadow flickered, solidifying. For a moment, she could see his face, pale, anguished, beautiful in its devastation. "Don't." The bathtub, Daniel. February 19th, 3 years ago. She opened the journal, her hands shaking so violently the pages rattled. "You wrote about it. Planned it. You didn't slip. You didn't have an accident. You chose to drown." "Stop." The word was a physical force. A gust of wind slammed into her, nearly knocking her off her feet. Books flew from the shelves, pages whirling through the air like angry birds. The lamp crashed to the floor, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the dying light through the windows. But she wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. She'd gone too far to turn back now. "You're not haunting me because you can't let go," she shouted over the howling wind that seemed to come from within the house itself. "You're haunting me because you're still running, still hiding. You built this prison cell by cell, and now you want to keep me here too, because misery loves company, because if you can make me stay then maybe." A photograph frame hurled itself across the room, shattering against the wall beside her head. Glass rained down. The cold was so intense now that her lips were going numb, her fingers stiff around the journal. "You don't understand." Daniel's form was obvious now, substantial as flesh, his eyes wild with something that looked like terror. I didn't know how to." "You were afraid." She was crying now, hot tears freezing on her cheeks. Afraid that getting better wouldn't be enough. Afraid that even if you climbed out of that hole, even if you let people in, you'd still be empty inside. So you took the coward's way out. The room exploded. The wardrobe doors burst open, clothes flying out like spirits fleeing a tomb. The curtains tore from their rods. Every drawer emptied itself, contents scattering in a maelstrom of fabric and paper and small, forgotten things. The wind was a living thing now, shrieking through the room with a sound like grief given voice. Evelyn pressed forward against the gale, clutching the journal. She could barely breathe, barely stand. Objects pelted her. Books, picture frames, the small porcelain figures from the mantelpiece. Something struck her temple, and she felt warm blood trickle down her face. "You're angry," she gasped. "Good. Be angry. Be anything but this. This passive, pathetic ghost who can't even admit what he did." "I was sick." Daniel's voice cracked like thunder. He was right in front of her now, close enough that she could see the water still dripping from his hair, still running from his clothes. His skin had the pale, bloated quality of something that had been submerged too long. "I was drowning long before the water. Everything hurt. Evelyn, every moment of existence felt like broken glass in my lungs, and I couldn't." His form flickered, the solid shape dissolving and reconstituting like television static. "I know," she said, softer now, but no less fierce. "I know it hurt. I know the pain felt infinite, and you couldn't see an end to it. But Daniel," she held up the journal, forcing him to look at it. "You wrote about me, about hope, about feeling something other than weight. You were getting better. You were climbing out. And that scared you more than dying did." "No." But his voice was weaker now, the wind beginning to die. "Yes." She took a step closer, glass crunching under her feet. "You were terrified that I'd save you, and you'd discover the pain didn't leave. Terrified. That connection wouldn't cure you. So you sabotaged it before it could fail. You killed yourself to prove yourself right." A sound like a sob tore through the room. The remaining objects suspended in the air dropped, clattering to the floor. The temperature rose slightly, just enough that Evelyn could feel her fingers again. "You don't understand what it's like," Daniel whispered. His form was barely visible now, translucent in the dimness. "To want to live and want to die simultaneously. To be so exhausted by existing that even the thought of getting better feels like climbing a mountain with broken legs." "You're right. I don't understand." Evelyn wiped the blood from her face with the back of her hand. "But I understand this. You don't get to trap me here. You don't get to make me a prisoner of your unfinished business. You don't get to keep me because you're too afraid to face what you did." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the house seemed to be holding its breath. "What do you want from me?" His voice was small, broken, achingly human. Evelyn looked at the wreckage around her, the destroyed room, the shattered glass, the evidence of his rage and pain made manifest. She looked at Daniel, this beautiful, broken boy who'd been so afraid of living that he'd chosen death, and so scared of death that he couldn't leave. "I want you to let me go," she said quietly. "I want you to admit what you did. I want you to stop hiding behind your haunting and face the truth. You didn't die because no one loved you. You died because you were too terrified to let them." A long moment passed. Then another. The room was still, the wind gone, the cold slowly dissipating. "I was so tired," Daniel finally said, and his voice held all the weariness of 3 years of limbo, 3 years of existing between states. "I'm still so tired, Evelyn." "I know," she whispered. And despite everything, the terror, the manipulation, the months of captivity, she felt her heart break for him. "I know you are." She set the journal down on the floor between them like an offering, like a bridge, like the truth neither of them could escape anymore. Outside, the last light bled from the sky. In the darkness of his room, surrounded by the evidence of his fury and his weakness, Evelyn and Daniel faced each other across the unbridgeable distance between the living and the dead. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Thornfield House, she thought she saw something flicker in his translucent eyes that might have been understanding, or it might have been a surrender. She couldn't tell which scared her more. The dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if. Even the sun was uncertain about entering Thornfield House. Evelyn sat on the floor of Daniel's room, surrounded by wreckage. Her back against the bed frame, the journal open in her lap, dried blood crusted at her temple. She'd been there all night, keeping vigil, waiting. He materialized with the first light, not dramatically, not with wind or cold or fury, but quietly, like a thought becoming visible. He sat across from her, cross-legged on the floor amid the broken glass and scattered papers, looking more solid than she'd ever seen him. Almost alive. Almost. I remember drowning, he said softly. The water was so cold it felt like fire. I held myself under. Did you know that? Gripped the sides of the bathtub with both hands. My body fought even though my mind had given up. It fought so hard. Evelyn said nothing. There was nothing to say. I thought it would be quick. Peaceful even. But dying is violent, Evelyn. Your lungs scream. Your heart rebels. Every cell insists on living even when you've decided not to. He looked down at his translucent hands. I died alone in a bathtub, holding myself under, and my last thought wasn't regret or fear or even relief. It was a surprise. Surprise that I'd actually done it. Daniel, let me finish. His voice was gentle now, stripped of the rage and desperation from the night before. I've been holding you. Here. I know that. I told myself it was because you needed me, because you were alone too, because we understood each other. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if you left, I'd have to face what comes next. Worried that I'd be truly alone in whatever this half-existence is. He looked up at her, and his eyes, gray as winter rain, held a clarity she'd never seen before. You were right about everything. I chose this. I engineered my own isolation and then used it as proof that I was unlovable. I was getting better with you, and that terrified me more than the depression ever did. Because if I got better and was still empty, he trailed off. It's easier to blame the darkness than to light a candle and discover the room is still cold. Evelyn felt tears sliding down her cheeks, warm against her skin. You were 23 years old, Daniel. 23 and sick and scared. You made a terrible choice in a moment of unbearable pain. But it was 3 years ago. You can't keep punishing yourself by punishing me. I know. He smiled then, sad and small. I think I've known for a while. But knowing and accepting are different things, aren't they? The light was growing stronger now, streaming through the frost-etched windows. In its glow, Daniel looked even more insubstantial, as if the morning itself was dissolving him. I'm ready, he said quietly. To stop. To let go. To let you go. Evelyn's throat tightened. Despite everything, the fear, the captivity, the months of manipulation, she felt a profound sense of loss. Where will you go? I don't know. He glanced toward the window, toward the light. Somewhere. Nowhere. Maybe just into the silence I've been avoiding. He turned back to her. Will you be all right? Truly. She thought about lying. Thought about saying yes, of course, she'd be fine. But she owed him honesty now at the end. No, she said. Not right away. I ran here, Daniel. Ran from a life that was suffocating me, from people who never really saw me. I wanted solitude, but what I really wanted was to disappear. Just like you. She wiped her eyes. We were both hiding, weren't we? Both so lonely we couldn't see straight. Both are using each other to avoid facing the real work of living. Daniel nodded slowly. What will you do? I don't know yet. She looked around the destroyed room, at the evidence of last night's violence. But I know I can't stay here. This house is beautiful and peaceful and so empty, just like my old life was. I need to stop running toward silence and start moving toward sound, even if it's messy, even if it hurts. That sounds terrifying, he said, but there was warmth in his voice. Affection. It is, she agreed. But I think that's the point. I think being alive is supposed to be a little terrifying. They sat in silence for a long moment, the morning light growing stronger. Daniel was fading now, his edges blurring, his form becoming translucent. He looked toward the window, the one she always left slightly open for him. "Evelyn," he said, his voice already distant. "Thank you for seeing me, for being angry with me, for not letting me hide behind gentleness and melancholy and all the pretty ways we dress up pain." "Thank you," she replied, "for teaching me that loneliness isn't noble. It's just lonely." He smiled then, a real smile, genuine and devastating in its sadness. Not the charming, melancholic expression he'd worn like armor, but something raw and authentic. The smile of someone finally letting go. He rose, or seemed to, his form barely visible now. He moved to the window, and as he did, the frost on the glass began to melt, water trickling down in rivulets like tears. With one translucent finger, he traced something on the condensation. A simple curve, a smile. Not manic or desperate or possessive, but gentle, resigned in peace. "Goodbye, Evelyn Carter," he whispered. "Live loudly, live messily, live in a way I never could. Goodbye, Daniel." Her voice broke. "Rest now. You've earned it." The last of him dissipated like morning mist, like breath on glass, like a thought released. The smile on the window remained for a heartbeat longer, a ghost of a ghost, a final message traced in water and light. Then it too was gone. The room was simply a room. The house was merely a house. The morning was merely morning, streaming through clear windows, illuminating dust motes and broken glass, and the debris of a haunting that had finally ended. Evelyn sat alone on the floor and cried. For Daniel, for herself, for all the ways they'd both been drowning long before water was involved. She cried until she was empty, until the tears stopped meaning anything, until she was just a woman sitting in a room full of wreckage, waiting for the strength to stand. Eventually, she did stand. Her legs were stiff, her body aching from the night's violence and from sitting so long. She picked her way carefully through the broken glass, the scattered books, the evidence of Daniel's rage and fear and final surrender. At the door, she paused and looked back. The room was still, silent, and empty. No cold spots, no watching presence, no voice in the walls. She was alone, truly, completely alone. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. 2 weeks later, Evelyn stood in the foyer with her single suitcase, the same one she'd arrived with 6 months ago. The house was clean now, and Daniel's room was restored as much as possible. She'd arranged for an estate agent to handle the sale. Someone else could decide what to do with Thornfield House and its beautiful, terrible emptiness. She'd called her sister. The conversation had been awkward, stilted, full of the careful navigation of people who'd grown apart but were willing to try again. They'd made dinner plans. Just dinner. A small step. She'd applied for positions in London, nursing jobs in busy hospitals, places full of noise and people and life. Places where she couldn't hide. She'd written honest cover letters that didn't shy away from her reasons for leaving, didn't dress up her isolation as a sabbatical or spiritual journey. She'd been afraid of what people would think. She was still afraid, but she was doing it anyway. As she pulled the door closed behind her, she heard no whisper of goodbye, no final chill in the air, no sense of a presence watching her leave. Daniel was gone and truly gone, and she would carry him with her, not as a ghost, but as a reminder, a warning, a lesson written in salt water and sadness. Loneliness is not romantic. It's not noble or poetic or pure. It's just lonely. And the only cure for it is the terrifying, necessary work of letting people in. She walked down the gravel path without looking back, her suitcase heavy in her hand, the morning air cold and sharp in her lungs. Alive. She was alive. And finally, after so long, she was ready to start living like it. Behind her, Thornfield House stood silent against the gray morning sky. In one, at the upstairs window, if the light caught it just right, you might have seen the faintest trace of condensation. A gentle curve, a smile. But Evelyn didn't look back. She walked forward into the noise and mess and terrifying possibility of the world, toward whatever came next, carrying her loneliness like a scar she'd finally learned to live with. And if tears slid down her cheeks as she went, they were warm. Human. Hers. She was free.